Dungeons and Dragons. It all started with a dude from Wisconsin named Gary Gygax, who created one of the first medieval fantasy tabletop games called Chainmail in 1971. After its creation, another dude named Dave Arneson played Chainmail and said, yeah, this is cool, but it could be cooler. So, Arneson made another game based off Chainmail called Blackmoor, a more fantastical game taking inspiration from Lord of the Rings. Then in 1972, Dave Arneson ran a game of Blackmoor for Gary Gygax, and Gygax loved it. Together, Arneson and Gygax molded their ideas into one tabletop game and then published it on their own, and thus, Dungeons and Dragons was born.
I'm Dominic Dawson.
My name is Blake Hooper.
I'm Jackson Gant.
My name is Karen McCarthy.
I work in the Teen Force program. In that program, I was allowed to have a subdivision where I basically just play D&D with teens.
I am an avid enthusiast of Dungeons and Dragons. I do a live play Dungeons and Dragons podcast.
I'm one of the dungeon masters here at Red Castle Games.
I work at Red Castle Games, and part of what I do is I am a professional dungeon master.
Dungeons and Dragons is an incredibly simple game on its surface.
You are sitting around a table with a bunch of friends or sometimes strangers, and you are telling this story.
It's really just play pretend. I'm going to play pretend and I'm going to try to do things.
Whether or not things work are determined by dice rolls.
For example, if you as a player say, I want to punch him, the dungeon master says, okay, roll the dice. Let's see if you're successful. Depending on the result of the dice, the dungeon master will then narrate the consequence of that, and then the players will respond to that consequence, Dungeon Master will narrate, and so back and forth. The role of the Dungeon Master essentially is
making sure we're following certain rules for scenarios, as well as guiding along the story.
Red Castle Games is a games store in southeast Portland, Oregon. We sell a lot of Dungeons and Dragons stuff as well as a lot of other great role-playing games.
What Red Castle is trying to do for D&D is have a place to play.
I would like to think of it as a welcoming environment where you do not necessarily have to conform to the sometimes rigid idea of what it means to be a nerd.
So, we provide the location. We're providing that Tuesday at 7, we're gonna have not only a table here, but a dungeon master here. We also provide
a space where folks can come and play those games in a
welcoming part of the community.
I have two groups who play at Red Castle right now who went through my program at Mount Scott Community Center and are now on their own, just doing their own game and adventures. I kind of wanted to keep this theme of building the community here because other than Red Castle Games or Guardian Games, there wasn't really anywhere else in the area that, offered like a D&D camp or class or a place for people to learn, and there were people who wanted to learn. But I kind of allowed myself to take up part of the responsibility of helping the resurgence of the game in Portland and kind of doing my part to try to help bring in new people who don't know the game, help people who don't have groups find a group. The more people playing, the better. The greater the community, the greater the cause. I feel like it's a really positive community, and the bigger it gets, the better, and the better will affect the world, because it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what your background is. At the end of the day, it's a bunch of people rolling dice and having a good time. Recently, I had two characters in my party played by two of my players. They had a very interesting moment where the last time they hugged someone was when they lost a loved one in their backstory. So they never actually physically embraced someone, and they both were in a precarious situation where they were sharing emotions with each other, which they haven't done really ever, and they embraced each other. And looking around the table, all the other players who are extremely quiet and a few tears were shed. And to think that that emotion could be drawn out of a role-playing game or out of a tabletop dice and paper, and it's weird to think about the human emotions and the emotions of characters and how that can enact a reaction like that out of someone. It was a tear-jerking moment.
I wanted to make storylines meaningful. If I was playing a character, I wanted that character to have meaning for me. You can have a lot of jokes and fun and really like lighthearted stuff with D&D, but you can also get into some really heavy stuff.
You don't really know that you're working through something until you're like into it. I think sometimes like getting into someone else's shoes and like being able to like explore a space, a like not a literal space, but a metaphysical space that is a little bit scary, a little bit dangerous, but to be able to do that in a safe way where your physical body is still here sitting in this chair, but we can get into some stuff that is a little bit deeper, a little bit more intense, is a really good way to expose yourself to new ideas.
At one point, a couple years back, I suffered a traumatic brain injury, a concussion, and it was very difficult for me personally to go through. And I was able to use Dungeons and Dragons, and specifically being a dungeon master, and to design a dungeon that was kind of a metaphor for what I felt like I was going through, and to be able to bring that dungeon to the game table with my friends and sit down and have them literally have their player characters navigate my emotional and psychological trauma and work together to get through it was one of the most, I think speaks to the potency of the game in terms of like its ability, its therapeutic ability, and its ability to get at some deep core essential human components.
And if I can work through it with this character in these scenarios that you're putting out, for us to respond to emotionally as another person rather than me having to respond to it in real life when there's so much stress and pressure, that helps inform how I can deal with that flaw in my real life. And that's just an example of, small time that working out. There are Dungeons & Dragons games being played and being used in prisons, being used as therapy, kind of group therapy sessions, rehabilitation, as a way to have empathy for this character that you're playing. Now let's switch that around and talk about you. Honestly, I think there's a lot that can be learned from just rolling a die.